June 1941. Adolf Hitler stood before his generals with absolute certainty. The Soviet Union was a rotten structure, he told them. Germany need only kick in the door and the whole thing will come crashing down. Within 6 months, 775,000 German soldiers would be dead, wounded, or missing. This wasn't a battlefield defeat. This was a planning room catastrophe, a strategic delusion rooted in racist contempt that refused to see the enemy as they truly were. Hitler didn't just lose a campaign. He proved that ideology divorced from reality isn't strength. It's suicide. This is the story of how Nazi racism didn't just corrupt morality. It destroyed military strategy, turning tactical brilliance into a death sentence for 3 million men. December 18, 1940. Hitler signed Directive 21, the formal order for Operation Barbarossa. The document didn't call for careful strategic analysis. It demanded faith. Religious, ideological faith that the communist state would collapse because it had to collapse. Why? Because Judeo-Bolshevik leadership was inherently weak. Because Slavic peoples were racially inferior. Because Aryan forces represented destiny itself. This wasn't propaganda for newspapers. This was operational planning. The concept of Lebensraum, living space, shaped concrete military objectives. Field Marshals Walter von Brauchitsch, Franz Halder, and Wilhelm Keitel translated Hitler's racial fantasies into actual orders. Seize Ukrainian grain. Capture Caucasian oil. Eliminate the Jewish communist threat. Professional military officers, men trained to calculate logistics and assess enemy capabilities, became executors of an ideological vision that treated warfare as racial destiny rather than strategic challenge. Franz Halder's war diary reveals what happened to dissent. Internal debates about Soviet depth did occur. Senior commanders like Gerd von Rundstedt and Fedor von Bock privately expressed concerns about the vast Soviet interior. But questioning whether the Soviets would collapse quickly wasn't just military pessimism. In Hitler's command structure, it was heresy. It meant you didn't believe in Nazi racial theory itself. So, the doubts were buried. The concerns were dismissed. And the planning continued on a foundation of delusion. The most damning evidence lies in how intelligence was processed. The Abwehr and Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, provided accurate tactical data. They counted Soviet divisions. They tracked troop movements. They identified weaknesses in border defenses. But when analysts tried to evaluate Soviet capacity to replace losses, to mobilize reserves, to sustain industrial production, ideology filtered every conclusion. Soviet organizational capacity was dismissed as inherently inferior. Why? Because the analysts couldn't imagine Asiatic peoples under Jewish Bolshevik rule matching German efficiency. They didn't want to imagine it. So they didn't. The conflict was real. German military professionalism versus Nazi ideological certainty. The amplification was systematic. Hitler's inner circle reinforced racial assumptions until dissenting intelligence assessments became career-ending. The transformation was complete. What should have been sober military analysis became ideologically driven wishful thinking. The catastrophe was locked in before the 1st Panzer crossed the border. But ideology doesn't win wars. Intelligence, logistics, and industrial capacity do. And on every one of these measures, German planning was about to collide with a reality they refused to see. German intelligence officers stared at reports showing Soviet tank numbers that should have been impossible. Over 10,000 tanks in the western military districts alone. Their solution wasn't to revise their assumptions. It was to assume the Soviets were lying. The Abwehr and Fremde Heere Ost had done their homework on deployments. They knew where Soviet units were positioned. They identified tactical weaknesses. They successfully mapped the frontline forces. but they catastrophically underestimated strategic reserves and industrial mobilization capacity. Yes, the Soviets had over 10,000 tanks, but German analysts dismissed most as obsolete BT and T-26 models, relics that would crumble before modern panzers. What they failed to grasp was the production reality behind those numbers. The Soviet Union could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The production capacity required for such replacement rates was deemed impossible. Why? Because Nazi ideology insisted the USSR was a backward Asiatic nation. Then German tankers met the T-34, 76.2 mm gun. 45 mm of sloped armor that deflected German shells like rain off a roof. The KV-1 heavy tank was even worse. 90 mm of armor that German guns couldn't penetrate at combat range. German Panzer IIIs carried 37 to 50 mm guns and just 30 mm of armor. The Panzer IV's 75 mm gun was short-barreled and low velocity, inadequate against Soviet steel. The technical superiority German planners had counted on didn't exist. Worse, only 3,350 German tanks faced an enemy that could mass-produce superior armor. Franz Halder's diary records the nightmare unfolding in real time. Soviet divisions the Wehrmacht had destroyed reappeared within days. New armies materialized from the east. Units German intelligence said didn't exist. Each entry shows growing alarm. Each report contradicts the planning assumptions. The enemy was supposed to be finished. Instead, they kept coming. Reinhard Gehlen, head of Fremde Heere Ost, provided accurate data about Soviet reserves. His reports documented the depth of Soviet mobilization capacity. The leadership misinterpreted every data point to fit their preconceptions. Obsolete tanks don't matter. Reserves must be limited. Soviet leadership must be incompetent. The conflict was undeniable. Frontline intelligence officers reported troubling data that contradicted leadership assumptions. The amplification was systematic. Each report was filtered through an ideological lens that reinterpreted evidence to fit Nazi racial theory. The transformation was fatal. By invasion day, German commanders believed their own propaganda, creating a disconnect between expectation and reality that no amount of battlefield success could bridge. Meanwhile, Stalin committed his own mirror image intelligence failure. Richard Sorge, Soviet spy in Tokyo, sent precise warnings about the invasion date and scale. Other sources confirmed the intelligence. Stalin dismissed them all as British disinformation designed to provoke war between Germany and the USSR. But here's the critical difference. Stalin's system, for all its brutality and initial chaos, proved capable of strategic recovery. The Soviet state could adapt. Hitler's rigid ideology could not. When reality contradicted Nazi racial theory, Hitler chose theory. Every time. German tanks rolled east that June morning carrying ammunition, fuel, and a fatal cargo of assumptions. Assumptions that would run out long before their supplies did. The German advance covered up to 600 kilometers in the opening weeks. Rapid, devastating, unstoppable. It masked a fatal vulnerability. Supply lines stretched beyond breaking point. By July and August 1941, Panzer Group Guderian reported less than 2 days' fuel supply. 2 days. Elite, armored units, the spearhead of the entire invasion, were running dry while still hundreds of kilometers from their objectives. By autumn, daily supply delivery dropped to 20 to 30% of requirements. 20 to 30%. The offensive was strangling on its own logistics. The rail gauge difference between German and Soviet track required time-consuming conversion. Every kilometer of advance created bottlenecks. Every victory pushed supplies further from the front. The rapid advance that looked like triumph was actually a rubber band stretching to breaking. And here's the detail that shatters the myth of German mechanization. Over 600,000 horses supported Wehrmacht logistics. 600,000 animals hauling supplies for the modern German army. The propaganda image of the fully mechanized Wehrmacht was a lie. The material constraints were real, but ideology refused to acknowledge them. Meanwhile, the Soviets executed the largest industrial evacuation in human history. Over 1,500 industrial enterprises were disassembled under German bombardment. Entire factories, tank production lines, aircraft assembly plants, munitions works were loaded onto trains bolt by bolt. Workers, machinery, raw materials, everything, shipped eastward under fire, rebuilt beyond German reach in the Urals and Siberia. This was the organizational feat German planners had dismissed as impossible for the inefficient Soviet bureaucracy. They were catastrophically wrong. Soviet industrial commissar managers, names often unrecorded but collectively heroic, coordinated this exodus while German bombs fell. Stalin's ruthless prioritization of industrial evacuation over immediate military needs proved strategically decisive. It was a calculation German racism prevented them from anticipating. German planners couldn't conceive that Slavic workers and engineers could achieve what Aryan industry could not. By late 1942, the answer became undeniable. Soviet tank and aircraft production exceeded Germany's. The nation Nazi racial theory, dismissed as incapable of sophisticated manufacturing, was outproducing the industrial powerhouse of Europe. The USSR was building superior T-34 tanks and Il-2 Sturmovix faster than Germany could destroy them. The conflict was brutal. Initial tactical victories created euphoria in German high command, while frontline units faced mounting supply crises. The amplification was geometric. As panzers advanced, their supply lines became rubber bands stretched to breaking. Every kilometer forward increased vulnerability. The transformation was complete. The very speed of German success became the mechanism of German failure. Meanwhile, Soviet industrial evacuation, deemed impossible by German racism, created the foundation for eventual victory. But the greatest miscalculation wasn't about tanks or trains. It was about people. The Germans had convinced themselves they were fighting a rotten structure ready to collapse. They were about to discover they'd invaded a nation willing to sacrifice everything. The initial German tactical superiority and Soviet chaos seemed to confirm every assumption. Millions of Soviet soldiers encircled. Catastrophic losses. Territory surrendered. Wehrmacht newsreels showed endless columns of prisoners marching west. Victory looked inevitable. But the asymmetry that mattered was strategic, not tactical. By December 1941, German casualties reached 775,000 killed, wounded, and missing, roughly 25% of the 3 million-man German invasion force. These were losses Germany's limited manpower pool could not sustain in a prolonged campaign. Yet Soviet military casualties exceeded 4 million in 1941 alone, including 2.6 million prisoners. Catastrophic losses that should have meant total collapse by every German calculation. Instead, the Soviets mobilized millions of new recruits by autumn. The Red Army replaced losses at rates German planners had deemed impossible. Soviet mobilization capacity shattered every German expectation. For every Soviet soldier the Wehrmacht killed, 2 more appeared from the endless East. You can see the realization dawn in the diary of Wilhelm Hoffmann, German soldier with the 18th Infantry Division. His entries trace an arc from confidence through shock to demoralization. The Russian troops are completely broken. Transforms into, we have underestimated the Russians. We have underestimated their country. The personal journey of discovering his leaders had lied about the enemy and the war. Soviet war correspondent Vasily Grossman documented the other side, panic transforming into grim determination among Red Army troops. The psychological shift from fighting for Stalin to fighting for survival. His notebooks provide the human texture of Soviet resistance that German planners never imagined. The human dimension of Soviet resistance contradicted every Nazi assumption. When partisan fighter Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya faced execution by hanging, her last words became a symbol of national defiance. "You can't hang all 170 million of us." She understood what Hitler's planners could not. The Soviet Union represented a population willing to endure unimaginable suffering because they were fighting for survival, not conquest. Her defiance was a mathematical rebuke to German assumptions about Soviet morale and willpower. Meanwhile, Georgy Zhukov embodied Soviet strategic adaptation. From initial chaos to organized defense to counteroffensive. His operational competence contradicted every German assumption about Soviet military leadership being inherently incompetent due to Judeo-Bolshevik corruption. By December 1941, the German advance stalled before Moscow. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers lacked winter equipment because planners assumed the campaign would be over before winter. The assumption was wrong. The soldiers froze. The conflict was existential. German soldiers experienced the gap between what they were promised and what they were facing. Endless Soviet reserves, superior tanks, brutal conditions. The amplification was relentless. Each final Soviet position revealed another line of defense. Each destroyed division was replaced. The T-34s kept coming. The transformation was psychological. The shift from conquerors to survivors. The realization that they were trapped in an unwinnable war of attrition. Hitler's rotten structure proved to be their own strategic planning. The door Hitler promised to kick in had become a wall, and behind it stood a nation that refused to be what Nazi ideology insisted it must be. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler stood at the peak of his power, commanding the most tactically proficient military in the world. He was convinced that racial destiny guaranteed his victory. 18 months later, the German Sixth Army would be surrounded at Stalingrad. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility would be shattered forever. Operation Barbarossa didn't fail because of Russian winter. It didn't fail because of any single battle. It failed in the planning rooms where ideology poisoned strategy. Every assumption that shaped German planning proved catastrophically wrong. Slavic peoples were not inferior. The Soviet state was not a house of cards. Communist leadership was not incompetent. Soviet industry was not primitive. The Soviets mobilized more men. They produced more tanks. They evacuated entire industries. They demonstrated a capacity for organized resistance that Nazi racism insisted was impossible. Franz Halder's diary documented the evidence. Wilhelm Hoffmann's letters captured the disillusionment. Soviet production statistics told the mathematical story. The reappearing divisions proved the mobilization capacity. All the evidence was there, but ideology is a powerful narcotic. And the Nazis had overdosed on their own propaganda. The historical parallel should have been a warning. 129 years earlier, Napoleon's Grande Armée followed the same road to the same disaster. Rapid advance. Logistical overextension. Underestimation of Russian strategic depth. Winter catastrophe. The lesson was there. German planners saw it and dismissed it because Nazi racial doctrine taught that Slavic peoples were inherently inferior, incapable of the resilience that destroyed Napoleon. Modern military academies now cite Operation Barbarossa as the definitive case study in strategic hubris, not just as tactical failure, but as a warning about how contempt corrupts analysis. Staff colleges teach that racial or cultural arrogance isn't merely morally wrong, it's operationally catastrophic. It poisons intelligence assessment. It distorts logistical planning. It creates strategic delusions that no amount of battlefield brilliance can overcome. German generals were among the finest tactical commanders in history, But they were planning an unwinnable war because ideology had predetermined their conclusions about Soviet weakness. Hitler kicked in the door expecting a rotten structure to collapse. Instead, he found 170 million people who refused to be what his ideology demanded they be. And that refusal buried the Third Reich in the snow outside Moscow, in the rubble of Stalingrad, and ultimately in the ruins of Berlin itself. Barbarossa stands as history's definitive lesson. Underestimate your enemy at your peril, but underestimate them because of racist contempt. And you don't just lose battles, you lose everything. The Nazis didn't just commit a military blunder. They proved that ideology divorced from reality is not strength, but suicide. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.